So it is my delight and pleasure to welcome to the podium Dwight Zscheile.
Well, good afternoon. It's so delightful to be here, and I want to begin by telling you a little bit about where I come from. So I live in Minnesota now. My wife and I have lived there for 13 years, but we grew up a long ways away from that. She grew up in San Diego, and I grew up in Santa Cruz County, California, where it's a little bit warmer, in case you hadn't noticed. And in Santa Cruz, most people don't go to church. I was one of those folks who spent my Sunday mornings maybe playing beach volleyball or surfing or something like that. And I was growing up in a story that I think is quite common. It says, you know, you're sort of like that hiker with that backpack. And everyone's on their own journey to sort of put in their backpack whatever stories or practices or resources they can find to make meaning out of life, and you go on your way, which means it's all up to you. And in that story says that you are what you can earn or achieve. Your worth is based upon how hard you work or how much you can accomplish. And if you make mistakes, there's not a lot of grace, not a lot of forgiveness, not a lot of space for reconciliation or restoration. Community is something you kind of cobble together, but it's not necessarily enduring, and so thus is always fragile. Now, I wasn't looking for church. Never occurred to me that church could be a solution to my search for meaning and community and identity and purpose and all of those things. There were some churches in the town I grew up in, I'm sure full of lovely people. Would never have occurred to me to go seek them out, especially not on Sunday morning, because the few experiences I had of going to church on a Sunday morning, like, when I was a kid and did a sleepover at someone's house and we all kind of had to go to church the next day, I just thought it was very weird. So the gospel had to come to me where I was, and that's what happened. It happened through a friend in high school who was embodying Jesus's way in her practices of service and forgiveness and mercy, and it happened in some books that I read in my senior year of high school, where this story from John's Gospel, from the 11th chapter of John's Gospel, was in both of those books, where Jesus, just before he raises Lazarus, has this exchange with Martha and Mary, as you recall. And he says, I'm the resurrection and the life, and goes on. And then he asks, do you believe this? And I wasn't quite sure what this meant, but I found myself somehow saying yes. And somehow beginning to enter into this different story, which says that, in fact, I and each of you have worth that is not up to me to earn or achieve, that we can't lose however many mistakes we make. It's God's sheer gift. So I started to pray, and I went out and bought a Bible, and it was a King James Bible. That was the only one I'd heard of, and there were all these different translations, and so it was kind of a hard book to read initially, but it was a Words of Jesus in red King James Bible. Anyone ever have one of those, right? Yeah, okay. So I gave up. I started in Genesis and gave up somewhere in the middle of Leviticus, but I turned to the back, and I'm like, I'm going to read the red bits because at least, that'll be clear. So that's what I did. It didn't yet occur to me that I needed to join a church. I mean, I knew there were churches. I didn't know anything about them, and I didn't know kind of what this whole thing about belonging, because where I grew up, spirituality is a private, individual search, right? A quest. So Christians came to me in my freshman dorm the first couple weeks, walking up and down the hallway and knocking on doors and saying, would you like to talk about spiritual things? And I said, by all means, I'd love to talk about spiritual things. And so I entered into conversation with a leader of a campus ministry and got connected into Christian community, which I found to be amazing. Now, were those Episcopalians, you think, going up and down the hallway, knocking on doors? Sadly, they weren't. And I wish they had been, because it would have saved me, a lot of time, because I spent about 6 months with an evangelical parachurch ministry that, again, I'm grateful for to this day, because they didn't assume I knew anything. And after about 6 months, I was spending most of my time arguing theology with the leader who was discipling me, so it wasn't a good fit for me theologically, but they cared enough to come to where I was and to take that risk of knocking on that door and inviting me into Christian community. So this way of life that I discovered in Christianity was life-saving, transformational. And I began there because my work is always with the sense of those who are outside the church, who don't know our story, and who don't have the experience of being in a community where you are accepted not based on what you look like or how accomplished you are or how much money you make, but based on being joined into this body, this community in Christ of unlike members from every tribe and nation who are reconciled not because they work hard at it, but because God's power and grace and freedom heals and restores new community. So I want to talk with you a little bit this afternoon about how we can take this story that we have into the spaces in today's world that desperately need healing and hope and reconciliation. Because we live amidst a great disruption. I don't need to probably convince anyone of that these days. And it's a disruption on a couple levels I want to unpack with you. It's a disruption in our broader society of many institutions, structures, ways of participating and belonging and connecting. And it's also a disruption very acutely of religious organizations, particularly those that are inheritors of the state churches of Europe, what we might call the Euro-tribal denominations, also known as the mainline denominations, who are particularly being caught in these disruptions. So I found a chart in Tom Friedman's last book that I found that I think illuminates some of the reason why, right? So they used to think that Moore's law, which is the processor speed would, for computers, would, instead of doubling every 18 months, they'd reach a point where that would just be physically impossible. And they'd plateau. Hasn't happened. And in fact, the rate of technological and cultural change is exponential. It just keeps going up. Now, the problem is that our capacity as humans, individuals, as well as our institutions, to actually adapt to this accelerated pace of change is not so exponential, right? Now, in this book, that line, the rate of church adaptation line, is not in there, right? Tom Friedman does not talk about it. I've added this because I think you probably agree with me, right? It might be a little even more gradual, right? And that might even be kind of generous, right? Problem is, we're somewhere about there, where we are actually caught in between this accelerated change and our ability as a society and as people and as churches to know how to make sense of it, to process it, to adapt to it, to digest it, and we feel like the ground is sort of shaking under our feet. It's this sense of disorientation and conflict and disquiet that is deep in our society and in us. So there are a lot of good reasons for this, right? And when we think about the tremendous economic transformations and displacements that have taken place in the last few generations affecting our communities, we think about how social media and technologies connected us in new ways and also, as we know, profoundly disconnected us, and the kind of micro-tribalism that's emerged in the last 10 years in particular, and common narratives that once unified American society have seemed to have been exhausted or broken down. It was said that the only virtue left was tolerance, but that was said before the 2016 election, and I'm sure that's not really there anymore. So part of this has to do with just how people live in American society, the changing patterns of neighborhoods and the ways in which people are connected or disconnected. So Bill Bishop wrote a famous book called The Big Sort, how why are there no more moderates in Congress? And well, it's not just because of the ways that districts are drawn. It's also because of how people are now clustered more and more by people who think and earn and believe like they are, rather than being connected across those differences. So what has this meant for many neighborhoods is a changing understanding of what it means to be a good neighbor. From, in many communities, being connected, sharing childcare and tools and potlucks and things like that, to simply, going your own way, and people spend more time with their intimates, with their immediate family and closest friends, and more time connected to people maybe far away, loose ties through technology and social media, and less time in that historic, what would be the rural village or the city neighborhood, where there was a larger group of folks that you would interact with and be connected to through various institutions in particular. Think about all of the labor unions and garden clubs and service organizations and congregations, right, that live in that middle space of connections. And they are all feeling these same sociological pressures, these shifts going on in terms of how people live. So there's something bigger than just what's facing the church in this. So I'm trying to understand more deeply, like, what's underneath that? There we go. I think there's a more profound shift going on in Western societies. Charles Taylor, the philosopher, talks about this as a move from an age of mobilization, which was really kind of American society from the 18th century up until really the 1960s, where people would associate and create voluntary organizations to get things done, and found a lot of meaning in serving and in leadership roles. And again, if you want to be a good congregation member, you join a committee. You formally join the congregation, you join a committee, and you work your way up to maybe being on the vestry or even senior warden. And that served American society pretty well in many ways. And there are lots of expressions of that in all kinds of different organizations for many years. But something shifted in the 1960s from people finding meaning and purpose through affiliating and participating in these organizations toward what Charles Taylor calls the age of authenticity. That a good life, a meaningful life, is found through plumbing one's own inner depths and expressing oneself, turning inward in new ways. Just think about all the spiritual searching, right, unleashed from the 1960s on, and we might say there are incredibly wonderful dimensions of that, right? But it's also had implications for how we connect and for those institutions that were designed for the age of mobilization. So think just for a minute about obituaries you might read in the newspaper from older generations, where you might read about so-and-so was a lifelong Rotarian and was active in this organization. But if you think about younger folks, obituaries, it might be like, oh, she was really into skydiving, She was, loved to do this activity, maybe by herself, or maybe in some, creative way, but not necessarily connected to institutions more broadly. So the turn toward the immanent and the intimate has been incredibly disrupting for established structures. As those depths, right, the depths that we seek to plumb in the spiritual life, shift from the outside to the inside, there's a sense that we all need to chart our own path, be original, right? Not conform, express ourselves through lots of choices. And again, there's wonderful dimensions of this. But there's so many options now. It's a supernova of possibilities. And all of that is one of the reasons why this shift is taking place, right? You just look at the math here. The top bar is age 65 and over, religious affiliation in America. This is even from several years ago. 2/3 of Americans being white Christians, and then smaller percentages, Christians of color, other religion, unaffiliated. Just go down to the bottom bar, millennials, and you can see about the same number of white Christians and Christians of color, and obviously the largest group being the unaffiliated. You already knew that, right? That's an enormous, enormous change generationally in both the Christian population of the US, Christians of color being much more of the future, and also of disaffiliation entirely from religious organizations. So how have we responded as churches and other denominations? Largely through trying to fix it, which is a natural impulse, right? You know, we all want to fix what's wrong. And particularly for those of us who are religious professionals, we've spent a lot of energy trying to get people to affiliate and participate in the church, right? So if people aren't coming to church as often, let's make it more attractive to them, right? If youth are drifting away, let's get them to stick, right? And underneath all of that, it's harder to ask the deeper questions of, are we actually forming Christian faith in people's lives? What does that look like? So I think we're in a moment where we need to go deeper. And I want to just say, there's no quick fix. You already knew that, but it's important to name. It's not your fault if your church is struggling to get people to affiliate and participate. If your church is not as vital or as large or as institutionally strong as it once was, these are massive cultural shifts that are far beyond any of us, far beyond our ability to control. And I think the question we need to ask is, what does it actually mean to form Christian faith and Christian community in this culture we find ourselves in? Which I think pushes us deeper into the tradition to rediscover roots. So what is the church after all, right? In some ways, if you look at it, you know, a lot of churches were designed functionally to be kind of social clubs. I mean, it's a meaningful place for people to connect. Depending on when your church was started, that may be deep in its DNA. And you may have members for whom that's really meaningful, right? That's why they're there. It might be churches kind of like a museum of some wonderful cultural and artistic treasures, right? We have this glorious musical tradition. We've got all this beautiful art. I love museums, right? These are genuine treasures, right? Seriously. Or it might be kind of like an antique shop, right? So how many of you have millennial children? Anyone with millennial children in the room? Okay. How many of you with millennial children, how many of your millennial children want your antiques that you have, okay? Like want to keep your antiques, right? A few of you, right? But fewer hands went up, I noticed, right? So, again, I love antiques, right? Wonderful treasures, but somehow not connecting in the same way. And then I think because we're Episcopalians, you know, I have a kind of Downton Abbey theory of the Episcopal Church, right? Right? So, you know, I know everyone's all in mourning, Downton Abbey's done, and you can still watch the reruns and all this stuff, but if you look at the kind of the people who watch Downton Abbey and the Episcopal Church, the Venn diagram, there's a certain, you know, kind of, there's a certain, you know, cohesion there. And so, you know, it's this kind of like Anglophiles, we have this wonderful kind of archaic, you know, cultural tradition, and we know the sort of economic underpinnings of Downton Abbey. You know, we know the world is changing, but isn't it fabulous, right? You know, isn't it glorious, right? And so all of that. What is the church? Here's the thing, though. If you go in this neighborhood, or probably neighborhoods in most of your communities, if people want to connect, they'll go to somewhere like this place in Minneapolis, which is an enormous brew pub called Zscheile that is packed all the time with all kinds of young people who would not ever come into our churches. They are finding community, and Zscheile has a thing called Zscheile Gives a Damn, where they organize community service. So if you want to do community service, you can show up. Zscheile will partner with a nonprofit, go out in the neighborhood, help some neighbors, and you get a free beer afterwards, right? And so for a whole generation, you have a lot of folks who are, some version of this. If you want to connect, just do that. We wouldn't even think about church, right? It's meeting those needs. So what is our work then? Well, for one, we have to be clear about what our story actually is. If we're simply another social and cultural organization, if that's all it is, it's going to be really hard for us to look like the diversity of our neighborhoods, for us to connect with younger generations, for us to pass our treasures on. So in our tradition, there is this deep commitment to, we might say, the vernacular, right? So the Reformation was all about the church's worship and life and the Bible and all that being translated into the language of the people. That's how we have the Book of Common Prayer, one of the great examples of that, right? And yet, the church has struggled to do that vernacular translation in each generation, right? So I love the Book of Common Prayer. I was an English major, all about it. It's not the language of everyday life for most people in our neighborhoods. Just saying, right? Just saying. So we need to connect our story in language that makes sense to people to their longings and losses, right? The things that really keep them up at night, that matter to them. And that's a fun exercise. That's a playful thing we can do. And there's lots of ways to get at that. One kind of fun way to do it is to take some of Jesus' parables, and even just in a small group at your church, translate them into your context today. So if the parable of the Good Samaritan were going down in your neighborhood, who would the people be? Who would the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan, who would all those folks be? What would it look like where you are? Translate it. Have some fun with that, right? Do that for any of Jesus' parables, right? To make them come alive. So here's the thing, though. The deeper challenge. Renewal Works is a ministry of forward movement, and they do a wonderful survey of Episcopal churches to find out where people are at spiritually. Anyone done Renewal Works survey here? A few of you? Right? So I highly recommend it. It's an incredible tool. And out of that data, Renewal Works has developed this kind of four-stage sort of spectrum of the spiritual life, of kind of where people are at in their spiritual growth. And the first is simply just beginning out, exploring a life with God in Christ, and you're taking the first small steps in the spiritual journey, all the way up to centered, where your relationship with God is the most important relationship in your life, right? So they've done this survey with about 12,000 Episcopalians in around 200 congregations. And here's the data. 18% are in the first stage, 55% in the second stage. These are just ordinary Episcopalians, right? 23% in the third, and only 4% in the fourth. So if you look at that, almost 3/4 of Episcopalians are in the first two stages of spiritual growth, and only 4% in the deepest stage. Here's another way of looking at it. They've defined if you look at these congregations as a whole, what are their archetypes? The troubled one is people in the church want to grow spiritually, and they don't know how, and the church isn't necessarily really helping them do that, right? So that's more than half of the churches who have done this study. Extroverted is, we're doing lots of great community service, and we don't really know how to connect it with God, right? So we're just, again, a good NGO in the neighborhood with liturgy kind of thing. Complacent is, we're not growing spiritually, and we're just fine with that. So we got some work to do as a church, I think, around actually going deeper, right? Around going deeper and helping the people in our congregations take that journey of spiritual growth, right? Of connecting more deeply with God and other people in the congregation and neighbors, of growing in love of God and neighbor. That might be a simple way we can define what spirituality is, simply growing in love of God and neighbor. So this is about, to me, not adding to our plates a whole bunch of lists of new tasks and getting busier. It is about actually rerouting ourselves. And if you think back to John's gospel, Jesus uses this metaphor of the vine and branches. Remember this, right? I'm the vine, you're the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. And Jesus talks in that chapter of John about pruning. Even the branches that bear fruit get pruned, right? So if you're hearing all of this and thinking, wow, our church needs to get busier, don't get busier. If anything, I think you want to look carefully at everything you're doing and saying, is this connecting us more deeply to God, each other, and our neighbors? And if not, do we still need to do it? Why are we doing it, right? Jesus is inviting us to be rooted in God's life, right? Branches in the vine. It is about receiving nourishment from beyond us. It's not about us summoning the energy, right, to get more people in or get more people to connect and do all this. I mean, honestly, most church leaders I know are tired. Anyone feel tired, right? Most churches are doing too many things and need to pare down, right? Need to do some pruning in order to free up space for this kind of dwelling, abiding, deepening. You might have seen this before, I hope, from our presiding bishop that came out at General Convention this past summer. Bishop Curry is inviting the church into following Jesus in Jesus' way. Now, in the book of Acts, the early Christian movement was called the Way, right? And this is really important, right? Because being a Christian isn't just about, being part of a nonprofit organization that you're affiliated with, or necessarily just about having certain beliefs, propositions that you hold. It's a way of life. And it's a way of life that's practiced concretely in daily life, right? Through doing things that Christians have always done. So Bishop Curry has, and Stephanie Spellers, and a number of folks who have worked on this have shaped a simple kind of outline of what that looks like, if you will, the way of love. And so it begins with turning. And there it is. And learning, engaging God's story, praying, worshiping, blessing people, and going. Finally, though, there's rest, right? And the rest is so essential for us to be freed from the ways in which our society colonizes us with busyness and distraction in order to be present to God and each other. The rest is essential. It is one of the commandments, you remember, right? Sabbath. I think Sabbath is the hardest, maybe, of all of the commandments in our society today, right? If you really take time off, it is incredibly disruptive and countercultural. So a rabbi friend of mine, Chaim Herring, he observes that, over the gates of Auschwitz, there's the famous phrase, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. And he says that is absolutely a perversion. It's the reverse. Sabbath makes you free because you realize the world doesn't depend upon you. You don't have to keep carrying it all. And in God's power and presence and agency, you can be freed. We live in a society that says work makes you free, and that is not true. So here's another way to think about this. And I'm drawing here from Samuel Wells, who's an Anglican priest and theologian. He says, there are four kind of modes of mission, if you will. The first is working for. This is familiar to many of us. That's doing good charity work, or what we often call outreach in our congregations, where, again, the church has some goods, whether some stuff to offer or some money to bless people with, and our neighbors need to receive it because they have a deficit. There's also being for, which is about taking the right positions, right? Having the right attitudes and ideas. There's working with, connecting with other nonprofits, community organizing, trying to mobilize in movements and networks to bring about change in society. And finally, there's being with. And being with is about listening, sharing stories, being present with people, participating in their lives. It's about a posture of wonder and connection on a deeper level. Be interesting to think about your church. If you were to map out percentages, where does your church spend its energy in terms of connecting with its neighbors in these quadrants? Right? I think many of us would say, yeah, most of our churches do some working for, right? Probably some of them do some being for, maybe some working with. Being with, maybe, but maybe that may not be so well defined. Now, Wells goes through the Gospels, and he looks at the whole life of Jesus in these frameworks, and here's what he adds. Jesus spent about 1% of his ministry in Jerusalem working for. About 0% of his ministry in being for. It wasn't really about, he had opinions, but they weren't necessarily the correct ones, and he got a lot of flack. 9% in working with, and 90% in being with. Part of the reason why I think many of our churches feel tired, and our leaders feel tired, and you might feel tired, is because somehow we've gotten a little out of whack around this. We've maybe lost in a society that pulls us apart and makes us so busy, how to be with God, how to be with each other deeply, to share stories, and particularly how to be with our neighbors. Where our agenda is not to fix them, not to fill some deficit they have, but to join with them, to dwell with them, to abide with them, to hear their stories, and to see what God does in the spaces in between as we connect together. So I want to just shift to think about some practices that can help churches move in this direction. And the first practice is listening. Listening is hard. Our society seems to have lost our capacity to listen very well. We like to shout or talk past each other or all kinds of things like that. Learning how to listen more deeply is fundamental. So I just finished a couple-year journey, a 2.5-year journey, working with some dioceses on the East Coast, with congregations in each diocese, trying to help them do some of this work of connecting more deeply with neighbors. And for the first year, we practiced listening in different ways, some of which you're going to do shortly. And the people in these congregations were absolutely transformed by learning how to listen more deeply. In their daily lives, their ability to be present to neighbors. I'm thinking of one woman who works in a school, and after doing these practices of listening, told a story about a coworker coming to her and kind of quietly revealing that she's been diagnosed with cancer. And this woman said, in the past, I immediately would have gone to, how do I help her fix it? Oh, I know of a good doctor you can go to, or what clinic are you getting checked out, or that kind of thing. And she said, but because I've been doing this practice of listening, I stopped, and I just held a space and asked her to share more of her story. And I was able to abide with her, to dwell with her, to be present with her in ways that were healing and transformational for both of us, right? So listening. And I think the listening needs to be on a couple levels. One, it's listening to God's story, to Scripture, in ways that are participatory, and we'll do that. We'll do a practice of that in just a few minutes together. It's listening to one another's stories, Those of you who were in my workshop this morning got just a brief taste of doing some spiritual storytelling, and you all have been practicing that even in these short 2-minute experiments today, listening to each other's stories, and then beginning to listen to our neighbors' stories, those outside the church. Another key practice is being hosted. So often our churches are geared up to host people. If people are looking for a church, we want to welcome them. And by all means, if someone's looking for a church, let's welcome them, right? But Jesus, in his ministry, did more being hosted than hosting, right? I mean, he didn't really stay in one place and say, come where I am. He was always moving around, and he was inviting himself over to people's houses, and going and being on their turf, in their territory. And sometimes he was inviting himself to people's houses that in the wrong neighborhoods, right? The wrong kind of people. Tax collectors and prostitutes and all kinds of folks, right? He was being hosted. We're going to enter a text shortly that will provide us some imagination for what that looks like from Luke's gospel. But when we're hosted, we're not in control. It's not our space. It's the neighbor's space. That matters. That's different, right? It changes us in our spiritual posture when we have to join a neighbor in her space, where she is, on her terms, not on ours. We have to rely upon others for our good, our well-being, for our hospitality, for our survival. And when we begin to identify places in the neighborhood, whatever that is, wherever you are, where we can invest presence and relationship as we are hosted, incredible things begin to happen. So I want to just tell a couple stories about that. Some friends of mine lead a church called Mill City in northeast Minneapolis. And it's a about 10-year-old church. They meet in a school. And they've intentionally started this church with the idea that rather than going to this neighborhood and try to get lots of people from the neighborhood to kind of be attracted into the programming of the church, they wanted to discern what God was up to in northeast Minneapolis and join in with that. That's kind of their primary assumption starting out, which is kind of unusual for a church plant. And so if you were to go into a neighborhood and do that, well, how do you figure out what God's up to in a neighborhood, right? I mean, you can't just sit behind your church doors. They don't have a church building. You got to get out and be present. So their practice has been to be hosted. And one example of that is they meet in a school, and in Minneapolis, every public school has what they call a site council, which is a little team of folks that are some school officials and parents and people who are not part of the school but in the neighborhood. And they can never find neighbors, to show up to these site council meetings because everyone's busy. So they said, well, we'll show up. And they started doing that and sitting there. And the school they meet in, the principal initially was very skeptical of having a church meet in her school. For all kinds of reasons, right? It's a public school. She's afraid they'd leave up some weird Jesus-y stuff, and the kids would come in and get have to deal with that mess on Monday morning or whatever. And so very skeptical. So my friend Michael just invested time and presence being hosted on this site council. He just showed up at these meetings for month after month and just sat there and listened. Because he kept showing up, some trust began to be built. And in one meeting, they were talking about this problem, which was food disappearing from the cafeteria on Fridays. Kids were stealing food because they didn't have enough at home. And the school is mostly free and reduced lunch. So the principal finally turned to Michael and said, well, you're a church. What can you do about this? He said, I'll figure it out. He didn't know what they were going to do about it. Went back, and they started some conversation. They started an experiment of putting some food in backpacks, and that led to more and more kids doing that, and the church starting a ministry that is now a multi-million-dollar nonprofit. It's in 170 schools. And in fact, so many non-church organizations want to volunteer that they're having a hard time. Their priority is to let churches actually do this. And the neighborhood wants to be part of this ministry so much that, they're competing for the space to do it. So as they became more and more present in the neighborhood, they started to get a reputation. So these buildings, on the left is Clare Housing. Clare Housing is a public housing community for people with HIV and AIDS. And some folks from the church, in just being out and walking the neighborhood, like you're going to do a little bit from now, just observing and wondering, they said, oh, this is an interesting building. I wonder who lives here. Nothing's marked on it. No one knows really. They didn't know what it was. So they went inside and they asked. They said, we were just curious. We're a church in the neighborhood, and we just wondered who lives here and what goes on in this building. And folks there were very friendly, and they explained what it was. And turns out they have a community room, and once a month they do these dinners where the residents come together and have dinner, and it's just kind of a community time. And so the church people said, well, could we come and join you for one of those dinners one time? And they said, sure, why not? So they did. They started showing up, and this wasn't like the whole church. This was just, 5 or 6 people from the church showing up there and starting to meet some of the residents, and eventually they were, able to share in the cooking with them a little bit and develop some relationships. And some of the folks there said, well, we really want Bible study because we're not sure what churches we can connect with, feeling excluded from many churches. So they started doing some simple Bible studies in the community room. And one of the members died. One of the residents there died. And before he died, he said, I want that church. That's my church. I want them to do my funeral. He'd never been to their Sunday worship, right? But he felt like this was his Christian community, these folks showing up, being hosted in his space, right? So the church came in and they said, can we, they asked us to do the funeral, can we do this and can we talk about Jesus? And they said, well, yeah, he was a Christian, sure, go ahead. So the community room was packed, dozens and dozens of people, everyone came out for this service. So next to the Clare Housing is a Section 8 public housing building, and the city has a certain amount of money that they want to give away to different kind of parts of the neighborhood for various purposes, and they couldn't ever get residents from these 2 buildings to respond to surveys about how the city should use their money. And so the city people were just frustrated, and finally they called the church. So the church gets this phone call from the city saying, we hear you're connected in the neighborhood, you Christians. We wonder if we can give you $1,000 to throw a party for the residents of these buildings so that we can hand out the survey and find out how to use their money. And the person who answered the phone at the church said, wait a minute, the city's calling to ask whether they can give us $1,000 to throw a party for the neighborhood. Yes, it would be the answer, right? So that's what they did, and you can see in the picture there's some, they had this huge block party, and people all came out, and they had a bouncy castle and music and food and all of this. So just by being present, just by walking, developing simple relationships, being with. So there's another group from the church that they have these things called missional communities, which are sort of small groups of folks who have a passion about something, about connecting with neighbors and the gospel in some way. And there's a group that was really feeling called to do something about human trafficking. And so they were out just walking, again, their neighborhood, walking Central Avenue in northeast Minneapolis, which is this, big street with all kinds of different stuff going on and lots of different, restaurants and shops and things like that. And they were walking and praying, and they noticed this place, Central Sauna and Bath. And they said, oh, wonder what that's all about. So they went inside, and the women went in, and from the church group went in and started talking to the women who worked there. And they found out pretty quickly that this whole place is a front for prostitution. So they got into conversation with those women and began to hear their stories. And over time, they worked to actually confront the owner of this place and to change the city ordinances in Minneapolis so that all the massage parlors are actually legitimate and not fronts for prostitution. course, now the women who worked there were out of a job, and they had to walk with them to help them find other employment, right? Now, they would never have imagined the journey that they ended up on when they started out. They were just some ordinary Christians walking around the neighborhood, praying, they were asking God, show us what you would have us see. Make us curious about our neighborhood. And that's the journey they ended up going on. There are lots of stories. When we have eyes to see and ears to hear, when we listen deeply, when we observe what God is up to in the lives of our neighbors, and we begin to join where people are and listen to their stories, the amazing adventures that God connects us into, to build relationships, to be reconciled, to be about the freedom and liberation and healing of all of God's people. So, listening and being hosted. So this afternoon, we're going to do that a little bit. We're going to first do some listening to Scripture and to each other, and I think there's some stuff that's going to be handed around here on yellow sheets of paper. And then you're going to have a chance to do a very simple walk around the neighborhood, because you've been sitting all day, and it's good to get a little exercise, don't you think? I know it's a little cold out there. It's not as cold as Minneapolis, so you can't complain too hard, right? It's not snowing. You can bundle up. So we're going to begin, though, with this simple practice of what we call dwelling in the Word. And dwelling in the Word is just something Christians, it's a version of what Christians have done for many generations, which is listen to Scripture in community imaginatively. And here's how it works. We're going to have someone who's going to come to one of these microphones and read this text from Luke's Gospel. And as the text is read, I invite you simply to listen to what captures your imagination. What word or phrase kind of takes hold of you, or do you get stuck on while the text is being read? You get stopped right there and you say, wow, what's that about, right? This isn't Bible study in a traditional sense. This isn't about getting the right answer or all that. This is just imaginatively entering into the text and trying to listen for it. What words or phrases kind of take hold of you or grab you? So there'll be a moment of silence after the text is read, and then I want you to do what you've already been doing, which is stand up and move around and find a reasonably friendly-looking stranger. Right? So you've already been pairing up, right? You're all comfortable with that mostly so far, I think. We're going to do that again. So you'll pair up with someone that you don't know very well, someone that is a reasonably strange person to you, but friendly, so it won't be hard. And you'll just spend a few minutes each sharing with each other what caught your imagination in the text. But now here's the tricky part, okay? You got to listen carefully to what your neighbor says, because after about 2 to 3 minutes each of doing that, at the table that you're sitting at, and it could be not the table you're normally sitting at, you're going to share with your table what you heard your partner say. Not what you were caught by in the text, but what your partner said to you. So you have to listen carefully enough to a partner to be able to give an account, a summary, to your table of what that partner said. And if you get it wrong, the partner can gently correct you, right? That's okay, right? So this is a listening exercise, a way of kind of rooting ourselves imaginatively in Scripture, but also listening more deeply to one another. So that's how it works. So we'll hear the text, listen to what captures your imagination in the silence. Then I'll tell you when to get up and move around, find a partner, and make sure you're at a table with a good number of people. It might mean joining up with a different table. Is that clear? Everyone know what we're going to do? Okay, so do we have a reader? We do have a reader. Okay, let's hear the text.
After this, the Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. He said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go on your way. See, I am sending you out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whichever house you enter, first say, 'Peace to this house.' And if anyone is there who shares in the peace, your peace will rest on that person. But if not, it will return to you. Remain in the same house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. Do not move about from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and its people welcome you, eat what is set before you, cure the sick who are there, and say to them, 'The kingdom of God has come near you.' But whenever you enter a town and they do not welcome you, go out to the streets and say, 'Even the dust of your town that clings to our feet, we wipe off in protest against you.' Yet know this, the kingdom of God has come near. I tell you, on that day, it will be more tolerable for Sodom than for that town."
All right, I want to invite you to find a reasonably friendly-looking stranger, which will probably involve getting up and moving around, which is a good thing, and spend a few minutes each sharing what caught your imagination or what you wonder about in the text. Is there a question you want to ask about the text? Listen carefully so that you can give an account of what you heard your partner say to that table. So get up and move around, make a new friend. So I invite you to, with your partner, find a table and sit down if you're not already seated, and make sure that you're at a table with a critical mass of folks, so a relatively full table. Stay with your partner, and we're going to turn now to sharing at the table what you heard your partner say. All right, so everyone find a table. If you're only a couple people at a table, pair up with another group at another table, and let's spend some time at the table sharing not what you heard or wondered about in the text, but what your partner heard or wondered about in the text, okay? Let's spend some time sharing at the table. So if you want to just finish up those last couple thoughts, maybe just another 30 seconds, make sure that that conversation is wrapped up and everyone's been heard from. All right. Well, I want to thank you for giving yourselves to this practice. Some of you, it's familiar. Others, it's new. We've given you the instructions on this yellow sheet, so you can take this back with you and try it out with people in your church, if you'd like. And this simple practice of dwelling in the Word, if there's one practice that I've found to be most transformational in congregations, it's this practice. So our church started using it 13 years ago, the church that my wife and I serve in St. Paul, and Episcopal Church, and it's something we do all the time, and most times people gather. We do dwelling in the Word. any vestry meeting or ministry team meeting or our Sunday morning kind of adult forum, faith forum time, even our midweek Eucharist, this is the sermon. So it's a practice that people are comfortable doing. They love to do it. You can do all kinds of different texts and try it out. So, but we're going to do another practice inspired by the text that we just dwelled in, which is a simple neighborhood observation exercise. So as you probably were talking about, you notice that Jesus gives some specific instructions here to the disciples, the 70, to go out 2 by 2. That's what you're going to do. Not to carry baggage. You notice that? No purse, no bag, no sandals. And to offer as a first word, peace. Right? Now, if Christian missionaries throughout history had always gone without baggage and traveled lightly and offered peace, wouldn't that have been awesome? Right? Instead of the complicated colonial history of going, to either condemn people or judge them or, bring a lot of, stuff all the time. So this is a text that invites us to go simply and lightly, to travel lightly, and to be people of peace, bearers of peace. So there is another handout, this one's white, coming around to your table. What we want to do is invite you into a very simple neighborhood observation exercise, right? And this is about simply walking around this neighborhood, which will be familiar to some of you, but unfamiliar to many others of you. That's fine. And to simply observe, going out 2 by 2. You don't need to talk to anyone. Okay? Just saying, right? So if you're really worried right now that you have to go proclaim Jesus to people or whatever, whoa, bring the anxiety down. All you need to do is go out and walk and observe, okay? In a prayerful way, in a spiritual way, all right? To notice. So some of you were at a gathering in Indianapolis in June where a smaller group of us did this in a neighborhood, and we met in a community center, and we spent, the same amount of time out walking the neighborhood. And I just remember one group went out 2 by 2, and they were kind of worried, well, what if they had to talk to people and all this stuff? But a couple of the neighbors saw them coming and said, "Are you doing a prayer walk?" And they said, "Well, yeah, kind of." And they said, "Well, can we pray with you?" So who knows what might happen, okay? So just saying, right? You might have the peace received warmly by neighbors. Or it's possible, as we know from the text, right? You might meet resistance, right? And the peace will return to you. You shake off the dust and move on, right? So what we're asking you to do is to pair up with somebody else. Now, if mobility is a challenge for you, that's okay. You can position yourself maybe in the hotel lobby or the lobby down here or somewhere nearby where there are people kind of out and around or it's public, and you can hang out there and just observe without having to move around too much, all right? So whatever works for you, we're inviting you to go out and really notice and observe and ask yourself some questions. You'll see these are on your sheet. Who's there, right? What are you observing? Who's missing? Who's around? Are there signs you see of the Holy Spirit already at work? Are there things that kind of capture your imagination spiritually as you're out walking around? Are there people in whom you see the face of the living Christ, right? So we want you to bring a spiritual and theological lens, if you will, like this pair of glasses, to what you're observing. You don't need to have answers to everything. You don't need to fix anything. Again, you're welcome to talk to people. But you don't have to, all right? It's okay. It's okay. Now, we also invite you to take pictures, and I'm going to have Gray say a little bit about that.
Okay. So as you know, we have a hashtag for our convention, hashtag NDDIO18. or you can do hashtag IndieDio. But take some pictures, and we have to be kind of respectful. Don't be creepy about this. But find something or someone, and ask their permission, of course, if you're taking a someone, that interests you or that catches your eye or that, in the words of Dwelling in the Word, sparks your imagination. And then put that on Facebook or Twitter, hashtag it, and then we hope to project it when we come back into the room.
And if you take a photo and what he just said about hashtags and Twitter and Facebook is like not something you do, but you have one of these, a smartphone, still take a picture, bring it back, because when we come back, you can share it at a table with some other people and tell the story, okay? So you don't have to take pictures, but that's one way simply to make the neighborhood come to life even more as you're sharing stories of what you experienced, all right? Even if you aren't savvy with hashtags and all of those things, okay? So if you look at the back of the sheet, you will see a map so you don't get lost, okay? We don't want anyone getting lost. You probably get into all kinds of interesting adventures that way, but what we'll do is invite you to pair up with somebody, and again, it would be wonderful if you paired up with a reasonably friendly stranger for this, okay? I'll leave it up to you, but I think it's great to do this with someone who is unfamiliar, because you'll get a whole new set of insights and experiences in walking with someone that you aren't really familiar with or married to, or someone who's your best friend or something like that, okay? So I'll let you organize yourselves to do that, but 2 by 2 would be preferable. If you have to have a group of 3, that's okay, but we don't want like groups of 20 Episcopalians converging on some poor neighbors and like, oh my God, who are these people, right? So 2 by 2, travel lightly. You're there to observe, to spiritually wonder, and to take some photos. Be back here at tables at 4:20, okay? So you have a little less than an hour. Plan your walk accordingly. 4:20 promptly, ready to share stories about what you experienced and what you discovered.
One more announcement with that is, in spite of the gospel, we're going to be taking our purses and bags with us, because we will need to, the staff will start turning the room for dinner tonight. Thanks.
Great. Have fun. All right. So before we break at 5 o'clock, we've got a little time for just, I'm curious, what was it experience like doing this? Are there any encounters or stories or questions that anyone would like to share? We've got our microphones up here. From doing this walk or the experience of dwelling in the Word, anyone be so bold as to come on up and share? I know there were amazing pictures being taken, and I could hear the buzz at your tables of all kinds of stories being shared. So let's hear from some of you. Don't be shy. All right. It was always the first person to go. Thank you. Come on up to one of these mics so we can hear you. No, you can just talk. And we're working on getting the photos in a format where they can all be shown, so just hold tight on that. That's a little more of a process. Yes.
But I'll explain the pictures, and then when you see them, you'll understand the
All right.
pictures. The very first thing we saw as we walked out the door, or I saw, and I pointed out to Carolyn, my partner, was one of those little scooters
Scooter.
shoved up in the bush. So I took a picture of it, and then I checked the bush to make sure there was nobody injured or hurt.
Hidden. All right. Good thing.
The Good Samaritan, and I was raised in the Good Samaritan
Yes.
back in Pennsylvania. So, the next picture we took was near the bus station, was a sleeping bag and an old tire, and of the homelessness and the cold and the. There was nobody else, so we looked we looked at the sleeping bag. The third picture was the tree. It's wrapped in a crochet for love of warmth, and it's for the hotline crisis, and it says on it, and that's one of the pictures. And then the last picture, as we went into the library, and as we were coming out of the library, there's a young gal with a service dog, and so we stopped and we asked her if we could take her picture. She, of course, wanted an explanation of why and what. And what I thought was from Carolyn, my partner, she said, D-O-G, G-O-D, God. That's our picture. So that's our.
All right. Thanks. Other stories, experiences you had on this, we'd love to hear a few of them. What happened? And again, what caught your imagination? We're bringing spiritual lens to this, right? So how do we connect some of these experiences with God? Yes, please.
Well, we saw some interesting plant life we took some pictures of, but what was really exciting, and I think the reason we were there, is we ended up going to my sister's closet. And it's a place that collects clothing and accessibles and toiletries for women that are hunting for a job so that they can have clothes to wear to go for an interview. And what's really sad is this convention center owns their building, and they have to move out of it. And they're trying to get money enough to move somewhere else, and I don't know if they'll be able to. But they've been there, I think it's at least 7 years, and there were quite a few people coming in. We took a picture of the lady. She was so sweet. I mean, we just clicked with her, so that was really wonderful.
So you found a neighbor who received the piece that
And
you
she
offered.
hugged us.
Oh,
Yeah.
all right. Great. Thanks.
And one of us really smelled bad. No.
Here we go. Another person coming up to the mic. Yeah.
So we were walking around the square, and we came up to a stoplight to cross the street.
Yeah.
And the light was red, and there was a woman standing there, and I said, "Excuse me, may I ask you a question?" And she said, "Sure." And I said, "If I offered you the peace of God, would it creep you out?" And she said, "No, I'm from Alabama." And I said, "Can you say more about that?" And
Good
she
follow-up,
said, "Well,
yeah.
in Alabama, we always have crazy religious things going on, so it wouldn't bother me a bit. But I wouldn't do that to somebody from Bloomington." So I offered that, and then we started to talk a little bit, and then it must have been enough, because on a red light, she ran across the street.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Leslie from St. Francis, Zionsville, and I had the pleasure of going with Sadie. Where is she? There she is. And we went on a walk towards Fountain Square, which is, a little indoor mall, and couldn't find anybody. I don't know what happened. There's like all of Bloomington left or something, but we found this lovely little coffee shop in the basement, and it was run by this really nice husband and wife team, and got chatting with them, and it turns out that they're from Afghanistan, but have been living here for 30 years. And the interesting thing is, one of the pictures I posted is in their coffee shop, they were selling coffee with a cause to help their neighbors recover from drug addiction. So I thought, wow, it takes people from halfway around the world to help us out with opioid addiction.
Wow. Thanks. Great. Yeah.
I'm Whitney Smith from St. James, Newcastle, and one of the pictures we took was of the same sleeping bag that Amy shot, but we took it from around the corner, and we discovered that the homeless people had been sleeping, it's kind of an irony, under a piece of graffiti that says love on it. We also found a school, Project School PS3, which is a charter school here. And I was a school crossing guard when I was 10, and there were all these crossing guards up there, so I went up and tried to relate to them. And the woman I spoke to is named Catherine. She wanted to know what parish Joan Head and I served, so we told her. She grew up in Christ the King Catholic Parish near where I live up in Indianapolis. We connected that way. And I thought, well, she's an hourly employee being a school crossing guard, but no, she's the principal and superintendent. And that's how she's a servant leader.
Wow. Great. Wonderful, these stories. Anyone else who wants to share? All right. Well, thank you so much for trying this experiment, right, of getting out and walking, and just with a different pair of lenses, if you will, to ask to observe spiritually, be open to encounters. And again, this is a practice you can take back and do in your place with a few people on some Sunday after church or whenever you want to do it, whatever is convenient. And then come back and share stories, right? So I want to, before we break, and there's going to be some announcements, I understand, before we break, I just want to say a word about an opportunity here in the diocese over the coming months and year to go deeper in this journey as a congregation. So at Luther Seminary, we're working with a number of dioceses and Lutheran synods on creating learning communities to equip congregations to take deeper steps in connecting with God, each other, and their neighbors through simple grassroots practices, sort of like we've been doing this afternoon, dwelling in the Word, listening more deeply to each other's stories, doing some ways of being present in the neighborhood, and some small experiments in connecting with neighbors. But doing it not alone and isolated, but actually together. Together as people within a congregation, together across congregations, gathering periodically for equipping and sharing and storytelling, and then dioceses being connected and synods being connected together to learn across from one another what is emerging. And so if you are interested in learning more about that, at 545, downstairs in the large Alcott room, I and the leaders of that process from the diocese will be there to answer questions and engage with you in conversation about that. So I encourage you to pick up, there's information, these little sheets in the exhibit hall, and there'll be more down there to come and learn more about that opportunity. But thank you.